Welcome back to the panel discussion, The Modern Federal Threat Landscape, sponsored by Blue Coat on Federal News Radio 1500 AM and federalnewsradio.com. I'm your moderator, Jason Miller. Our guests today are Harry Baswada, the CIO of the Army PEO-EIS, Todd Scharf, the CISO and the Associate Director for Information Technology in the Securities and Exchange Commission, Chris Kinahan, the Treasury Department's Director of their Security Operations Center, and Aubrey Merchant, the Security Director from Blue Coat. Now, gentlemen, before break, we were talking a lot about different pieces of the threat landscape. One of the things that I think that we started to touch upon a little bit was predictive analytics, the idea of do you understand what's happening inside your network, and can you predict where the next attack is coming? Let me turn to Aubrey, because I think this is something that you've touched upon several times, and the idea that if you don't know what's happening inside your network, you can't understand what's going out, coming in. How do you protect against it? How do you defend it? What are you seeing, again, from clients' perspective? What is Blue Coat working with agencies on to deal with this idea of predictive analytics?
More so than considering it to be predictive analytics, let's maybe try to think about it at some level as retrodictive analytics, if you will, a new word for you. So, the fact of the matter is we don't know what the threats are going to look like tomorrow. We may not know what they look like today. But if we look at a Verizon breach report from 2013, what we know is that it takes months for, let's say 68% of the breaches, I believe is the number, before they're actually discovered. So if we're able to discover those threats earlier, then that should mean we should be able to mitigate them a lot quicker than we have been able to. So how do we do that with analytics, let's say? So, I talked a little while ago about implementing protocol parsers, being able to get better attributes out of actual network flows, and this notion of richer network metadata or richer network flow data. So if we think about the ability now to take that capability and, say, utilize it to reconstruct artifacts as they're transiting your network, as they're coming in or going out, being able to reconstruct those files, and then maybe do something as simple as taking hashes of those files, and not just straight up MD5 or SHA-1 hashes, but implementing something called fuzzy hashing, which we can talk about. But that's essentially taking an artifact and breaking it up into pieces and hashing each piece. The benefit there is that you'd be able to understand some sort of let's say, relationship between one file and another, which I think is very key. So being able to have those artifacts hashed as they're going across your network are going to allow you to see traffic patterns that you wouldn't be able to see before. And then being able to take those hashes and then associate them with either IP addresses, or let's consider social personas. Maybe that's someone's login name, or someone's Twitter account name, or what have you, anything that we can extract from the network and index. Then we can correlate that with these other file types so that we could start to see patterns that we hadn't seen before. So now that when we know that, hey, I just discovered this 0-day thing, I have the ability now through the metadata to go back and say, hey, have I ever seen anything like this before? Of course, it requires that I have metadata to be able to go back in time to do that sort of analysis, but I think that's where we're seeing things moving very quickly.
So I wanted to bring up one thing about I love the fuzzy hashing. So that's a great name for a band, I think, the fuzzy hashing. But let me ask you about that, because it's reactive in some ways, and really what the government seems to be wanting to move to is predictive, dynamic. That's what you hear all the time about continuous monitoring. You're really calling for both here. You're not saying let's just look at it after the fact, but one can lead to the other.
So we could take that notion really to sort of the ultimate end, which is being able to take this information that we're learning and feed it back into an engine, let's say, and share it out with the community at large. And Blue Coat actually has that sort of infrastructure, but trying to stay generic on this discussion, now that I know something is bad, wouldn't it be nice if Army could share that with Cyber Command? Or wouldn't it be nice if they could just, say, hey, you guys may not have seen this yet, Air Force, but, we're seeing this activity on our network. Look out for it because we think it's going to do bad things.
And that's the idea of mitigating the risks.
That's right.
Earlier, Harry.
Actually, this is perfect. Senior leaders between the Air Force and the DISA, the Army, and our Seven Signal guys and NetCom, they all figured it out. And now what they wish to do as an operational thing also is actually embed each other's joint NOCs or TICs, as you call them. But this way, the Network Operations Center is not going to have just by DISA alone. We'll have Army personnel in there, Air Force personnel in there. Similarly, we're now trying to have failover system at the other service components where we'll have their personnel as well. So we will not only be sharing and viewing with the common tools, same visuals and knowledge, but we'll have personnel as well to deal with them. And I think this is something everybody has been recognizing as a big, important area.
And I think you're seeing that at the Homeland Security Department with the NKIC, which has people on their floor from the ISACs. We're hitting an acronym greatness here. But Chris, from your Security Operations Center, do you have people from the financial community or financial services sector working with you closely in some way, whether they may not be on your floor at the Security Operations Center, but there's that real-time communication?
So we have that both within the financial sector as well as on the federal side. I think you were kind of alluding to, Aubrey, the machine-to-machine type communications. And so that's something that we've been working towards. So from a financial sector standpoint, we do provide threat information to the financial sector. There's whole teams at Treasury dedicated to identifying and providing threat information to them. And we, for the internal defenses, feed into that stream. We also provide relatively real-time information to other federal agencies on a regular basis in terms of the threat activity we're seeing, as well as ingest that data from them as well.
Do you have the bureaus, for instance, IRS is a huge bureau at Treasury. It's the 800-pound gorilla, and I mean that in the most nicest way. Do they have their own Security Operations Center, and then are they inside your Security Operations Center, the Treasury umbrella?
So each of the Treasury bureaus has their own security operations centers to different degrees. Obviously, IRS has a much more extensive one than maybe one of the smaller bureaus. Us, in our departmental role, work with all of those bureaus and their associated SOCs. We're not co-located with them, although we talk to them on a near real-time basis, and we share information with them regularly.
And Todd, how about you guys from your end? Now, you guys are a much smaller agency. Right. I'm sure you have offices outside of D.C., but do you have the one Security Operations Center, and then are you sharing it with obviously financial sector as well, or how does that work?
Yeah, we have one Security Operations Center. The sharing is not real-time sharing. It's not like our SOCs connected with anyone else, but we do share information with the financial services industry through the FS-ISAC and the FIBIC, and we coordinate and correlate quite a bit with what Treasury is seeing, and also take some of the word they get from the industry and act on that. And
that's this will be a whole different discussion about critical infrastructure protection and through NIST, what they're working on. But let me take us back around. One of the things that when we talk about analytics, when we talk about the idea of sharing data, is the insider threat. Now, Todd, you brought this up at the very beginning, and you brought it from the standpoint of training, and making sure that the average person at the SEC understands, don't click on a link you're not familiar with. If an email seems fishy, if Chris sends you something by email and you're not really expecting anything from Chris, don't just click on it because you trust Chris. There's a lot of different attacks that happen. From an insider threat perspective, what are some of the steps you're taking to kind of help mitigate those risks?
The big thing is education. And I think it's, for us anyway, it's becoming pretty effective. We're getting a lot more calls and emails forwarded to us on a regular basis, and which is good. I mean, it creates more load on our team. But it indicates that our user population is aware of what's going on and they're concerned. That's a big plus for us. The other part is behavioral analysis and kind of having an idea what goes on the network, knowing your environment, not purely from a network standpoint, but from an object and object class standpoint. If you've got assets that are accessed a certain amount of times a day by a small population, and all of a sudden you're seeing that traffic and that access increase, it's not necessarily something wrong, but it's something definitely you should be asking questions about and see if that correlates to any of your other events, whether it's data loss prevention or through your intrusion protection prevention, things like that.
And that comes back around to that idea of understanding what's happening inside your network. As Aubrey, you were shaking your head like, yes, that's what we need, and not just the idea of education and training, but understanding then if something is abnormal that's happening.
That's right. Exactly. So, I mean, sort of beyond what you might be looking at with, say, NetFlow data as far as being able to get that sort of network behavior baseline, really what's needed is to be able to take that level of really attribution to the next level. So here's a particular subnet, here's a particular user, here's how many files he received, here's how many websites he hit, here's how many emails he sent. Being able to have that level of detail down to an individual human, if not a specific asset, is going to provide us with the type of analytics that we need to really feed those next generation analytics engines.
But does that come back around to having just too much data again? I mean, there's how many people are at Treasury? There's
over 100 and some thousand.
100 and some thousand. I mean, if you're worried about 80% of them or 90% of them, because there's some people who maybe don't touch computers very often. Doesn't that cause, again, another deluge of data?
It does and it doesn't. I guess the way that I would probably want to case that is that, the amount of data that we can get, well, first of all, let me back up and say that, arguably the best intelligence we're going to get is right off the wire, so to speak, right? Or out of the cloud, if you want to look at it that way. So there's no question either that packet existed or it didn't. There's no question about somebody breaking into your network and, fixing a log file and trying to cover up their tracks or what have you. If it was on the network, first of all, you have to have the ability to capture it losslessly, and then you need to be able to richly attribute what happened on the network. So, where we are right now, I think with SIM technology and other capabilities is that, they're only as smart as the computers that are feeding them information, first of all. And I don't know if we'd want to get into the discussion, but I would say being able to correlate activity at that level is very difficult. And there are some companies that are doing it, but it's not an easy problem. Being able to correlate that activity based on attribution over the network is a little bit simpler, quite frankly, because, again, being able to just, have a richer flow attribution and indexing that information and storing it in a lightweight but meaningful way is going to allow us to have, better visibility and better sort of, again, retrodictive analytics capabilities, as we discussed before.
Ty, now you were jumping in there too. What about that conversation that kind of sparked you?
Well, I mean, I completely agree that you have to look at it from a network standpoint, but there's also the component from an object level auditing and monitoring standpoint. And that's really where we're trying to focus some of our attention now on identifying that behavioral type of analysis. To correlate that with the network events, it helps eliminate some of the false positives. If we see, like I said, a certain file set that's rarely accessed, but we know where our crown jewels are, and all of a sudden we're seeing a flood of access attempts or successful access, and we're seeing correlating that with network events that indicate something's leaving the environment or going somewhere within the environment it shouldn't. That sets off a red flag. So it's more than, there's a lot of data coming in. There's more data. I think it's good. It's just being able to have the tools in place to correlate the events and get to what you need rather than chasing your tail.
Kind of where we are right now is we're sort of in a transition, right? So I mean, there's regulations that we have that says you must do these things, and we're doing those things. And we're doing them very well. But is it really giving us the level of detail that we need to be able to solve our mission? So my argument would be is that we're kind of moving towards this this sort of richer, more collapsed sort of logging environment that's going to be able to give us better context about what's happening on the network. So there's not a lot of effort involved in correlating that activity.
All right. Well, we are running out of time. Before I let you go, I definitely want to turn to Harry real quick and talk about the idea of attribution and authentication, and give us the minute quick highlights about how DoD is dealing with that idea of authentication, especially from a mobile device. You showed us something in a break about the CAC card and your iPhone, but just give us the heads up on that.
Okay. Two things. Mr. Kai from DoD CIO has embarked on creating a 4 million user authentication service, CAC authentication service. And so that user credentialing is very important. And the second thing is we're now focusing also on the device credentialing with 802.1x. These are the things that will help us with the insider threats. And the other area is in the bring your own device, or that we strongly believe that, at least personally anyway, that you have to stay gun compliant. We are requiring people to use common access card. And create a dual persona on a device. And if, in absence of that, there will be some senior leaders that may have a need for a variety of reasons, may want to use their iPhones or iPads and others. So that's what I was showing earlier, was where you could actually take a phone and use the device to plug it in at the end and use a CAD card, and you can do your stuff. So you could operate your devices, and doesn't have to be state compliance because you bring your own device. But we believe it's important enough to provide them a solution, material solution.
That reader side.
Yes, sir.
All right. Well, let me let's look forward for a second. We're almost out of time. Let me start with Chris, and then the table, since we started with Harry at the beginning of the show. where are you seeing the threat landscape moving over the last 1, 3, 5 next few years, and how are you dealing with it? How are you preparing for it?
So, we've talked about a couple different things over the panel. And so we've talked about how the attack surface is increasing even while we're trying to decrease the more traditional portions of it. And, the common theme that I've heard throughout this entire conversation is big data and analytics, and how do we dig through that and how do we identify the important information. And so I think, that's something we can't run away from. We can't always sit there and say, hey, we should just take in less data and make it richer. I think that's a great approach. I would love for us to be able to do that. But we also have to plan for okay, we're just going to have large amounts of data. How do we analyze that in an efficient manner? And, I think one of the limitations of our field is that we're all IT people, and we always think of things as an IT problem. And we need to start thinking and looking at different areas to be able to bring in other expertise. So, for instance, we think of nodes as devices and people and things like that, but we really need to tie it back to the individual, and not just the individual, but their job function or their office, because what's normal for their activity may apply to that particular position. When they change positions, that may not be considered normal activity anymore, or vice versa, someone else comes in. Along those lines, from an analytics standpoint, my bank can somehow magically tell when someone uses my credit card or thinks they use my credit card in some place that I shouldn't have, and they give me a call within a couple minutes. That's some very powerful analytic abilities there in terms of trying to identify anomaly detection. And we should really try to reach out and figure out how to apply those types of lessons learned into a security and IT realm.
All right. Let me move over to Todd. Todd, you get about 30 seconds. Chris took all your time.
That's right. Coming in the next 3 to 5 years, the advanced persistent threat is a big thing right now. But if you look at the root of it, a lot of these threats are relying on already vulnerabilities we already know about, impatchable and vulnerabilities we can mitigate. They're just putting these advanced persistent threats together in more creative ways, and allowing the data to exfiltrate in more creative ways. I think it's being proactive and making sure that you have a sound basis for your security program, and your controls are in place, and then detecting the anomalous behavior.
All right. Aubrey?
So I think we're going to continue to see these advanced persistent threats really, continue to evolve, quite frankly. And from a Blue Coat standpoint, certainly we're going to be figuring out how to build a better mousetrap. We think we've got something that's going to get us a little bit closer. I think the real key, though, is providing solutions that are going to allow us to detect these things faster, so that we could remediate them quicker. That's the bottom line.
And Harry, you get the last word.
Well, as we all know, threats are increasing and evolving, and budgets are decreasing. So what we need to do is partner up with our partners in Air Force, DoD CIO, and DISA, all within Army as well, where we partner together and build better transport as well as better applications where security is kept in mind, and quickly deploy, working with industry, the best-of-breed products to protect ourselves.
All right. I'm not envious to be in your position at all. You all have a tough job, but this was a great conversation. Unfortunately, we are out of time for today. You've been listening to the panel discussion, The Modern Threat Landscape, sponsored by Blue Coat on Federal News Radio 1500 AM and federalnewsradio.com. I'm your moderator, Jason Miller. Our guests today were Harry Baswada, the CIO of the Army Program Executive Office, Enterprise Information Systems, Todd Scharf, the Chief Information Security Officer and the Associate Director in the Office of Information Technology at the Security and Exchange Commission, Chris Kinahan, the Treasury Department's Director of the Security Operations Center, and Aubrey Merchant, the Security Director at Blue Coat.